Hello, and welcome to the Declaration Station podcast, a brand new revolutionary podcast hosted by me, Ben Reingold. This is the first and only episode of Declaration Station, so please, for your own sake, do not get too attached. This episode focuses on a document that is arguably the most famous and significant in American history, the Declaration of Independence, the moment that the leaders of the American colonies proclaim that they are breaking up with Great Britain and forming their own independent country. Since I teach about the Declaration of Independence all the time in my U.S. history and government classes, I wanted to ground myself by asking some friends what they remember about that document. Can you tell me, what do you know about the Declaration of Independence?
I believe the Declaration of Independence was the document signed by the founding fathers of America to declare their independence from Great Britain.
We the people, the United States of America.
So that's the Constitution.
Yes,
Close.
You're right. I know that it was signed in 1776, and it was about us freeing ourselves from Britain rule.
It was the document that ratified the United States as a country, I believe. And it was our way of, thumbing our nose at the British, essentially saying, hey, we're not a part of your little game anymore. We've all grown up now, Get out of my life, Dad, basically.
When I prompted my friends to see if they could recall a specific part of the text of the Declaration of Independence, there was only one line that they had any success with. We hold these truths. Can you fill in the blank?
To be self-evident that all men are created equal, Then that's it. That's all I know.
What if I said, you're on the right track. What if I said, we hold these truths?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Jody. You did a great job. What if I said, we hold these truths?
Oh, yes. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
So it's the beginning of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence that seems to really stick with us, to resonate with Americans in a way that no other part of that document does. It goes like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's for good reason that this sentence has taken on such significance in our society. For one thing, the claim, all men are created equal, is kind of a big deal, especially in a country that's been fighting about equality and what that means for 250 years. And then there's the part about God giving all men unalienable rights, meaning rights that cannot be taken away, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, part of why this line is so famous is because it has been cited often throughout our nation's history. Abolitionists began citing this document in support of their anti-slavery cause in the late 1770s. They asked, how can slavery be allowed in a country where all men are created equal and entitled to liberty? During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln delivered his moving Gettysburg Address, and he began that address with a direct reference to those words of the Declaration of Independence. 7 years ago, he spoke, calling back to 1776, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He quotes directly from the Declaration of Independence. His assertion is that by fighting for the end of slavery, the Union is fighting for the equality that was promised by the Founding Fathers in the Declaration of Independence, as if he's finishing the job of the Revolution by securing justice for all. This idea is echoed by abolitionist and U.S. Senator Charles Sumner in his eulogy for Abraham Lincoln following Lincoln's assassination. Sumner argues that the Civil War, quote, will have failed unless it consummates all the original promises of the Declaration our fathers took upon their lips when they became a nation. So, these figures understand the Declaration of Independence to be a promise of equality, racial equality. John F. Kennedy at Independence Hall in 1962, during the Civil Rights Movement, explained that the Declaration of Independence was not merely a revolution against the British, but a revolution in human affairs. Most famously, there's Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech at the 1963 March on Washington. King, near the beginning of the speech, refers to the Declaration of Independence directly. Here's what he says.
Architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
King says explicitly that the Declaration of Independence was a promise of racial equality, a promise, King goes on to explain, that America has failed to keep. It's safe to say that when it comes to the centuries-long black freedom struggle, this language from the Declaration has been invoked frequently. It allowed abolitionists and civil rights activists to claim that their cause was consistent with that of the nation's founders. Of course, the righteousness of the anti-slavery movement and the civil rights movement is abundantly clear to all of us today. But that wasn't the reality at the time. Abolitionists and civil rights activists faced fierce opposition, so invoking the language of the founding era was a powerful rhetorical tool. It's much easier to bring people to your side when you claim that you're carrying on the values of the founding fathers. The women's rights movement, albeit in a slightly different way, also invoked the language of the Declaration. At the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, a group of early women's rights activists drew up the now well-known Declaration of Sentiments. This declaration proclaims boldly, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Now, these women's rights activists are using the Declaration of Independence in a different way. Instead of claiming that the Declaration in its original form supports their cause, like some leaders of the black freedom struggle do, these women are endeavoring to change, to update, to improve the Declaration and make it more gender inclusive. Lin-Manuel Miranda pays homage to this effort in Hamilton, an American musical, with this fictitious line from Angelica Schuyler.
You want a revolution, I want a revelation. So listen to my declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm gonna compel him to include women in the sequel. Right!
What these two movements have in common is that they both appeal to the egalitarian spirit of the Declaration of Independence. They see their causes as consistent with the founding values of the country, and they often cite the Declaration as evidence of that fact. But this all poses a very interesting question. Did Thomas Jefferson and the other architects of the Declaration of Independence actually intend for the document to be an endorsement of movements like abolitionism or women's rights? Did they really mean to provide support to these movements that threatened the superiority that they experienced as elite white men? Put simply, the big question, the question that we're going to focus on, is this. What did all men are created equal actually mean to the founding fathers? And why did they include this statement in the Declaration of Independence? Remember, the political purpose of the Declaration of Independence was to announce and justify the colony's decision to split off from the British Empire. The document certainly could have done that without asserting that all men are created equal. The writers could have just argued, as they do later in that second paragraph, that the purpose of government is to promote the welfare of the people, and the British had failed to do so. That would have been enough to explain why they were declaring independence. But they still chose to include that statement about universal equality. Of course, at the founding era, the United States was a deeply unequal society. First and foremost, it was a slaveholding society. Nearly 500,000 African Americans were considered property in 1776. Thomas Jefferson himself owned over 600 enslaved people over the course of his life. How could he believe that all men are created equal while simultaneously running his own slave empire? And it wasn't just African Americans who were treated unequally. Native Americans, women, servants, children, and non-landowners were all treated in different ways and to different extents as second-class citizens. Given all of that, how could Jefferson and the others possibly write with a straight face that all men are created equal and entitled to rights? Whatever they meant by this, it clearly didn't have the same exact meaning to them as it does to us now. So I endeavored to find out why this language was included in the Declaration of Independence, what purpose it served, and what it was intended to mean. And as I conducted my research, it felt like this question in a lot of ways became more complex, not more clear. But nevertheless, I'll do my best to explain what I learned and how I made sense of all of this. So I'm going to make a somewhat bold claim in this part of the episode. I'm going to argue that when the founders wrote, "All men are created equal," they were not talking about individual people in the way that abolitionists and women's rights activists were. Instead, they were talking about something I'll call collective or group rights. They were saying we as North American colonists are equal to you as British subjects in England, and therefore we can split off from you. I'll get to my reasoning for that claim in a little bit, but first it's worth mentioning that people had different perspectives on the meaning of the Declaration's text, even as early as 1776. When the Declaration was first printed and distributed, most people actually didn't even pay much attention to that first part of the document that we've been discussing. It was seen as sort of the Founding Fathers getting all philosophical and boring. It wasn't nearly as juicy as what comes later in the document, which is a fiery list of complaints against King George. Still, there were some people, even in 1776, who did think about that philosophical introduction and what it meant. Some used it to challenge American slavery. Thomas Hutchinson, the former royal governor of Massachusetts who opposed the Revolution, wrote the following in his response to the Declaration of Independence. "I could wish to ask the delegates of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas how their constituents justify the depriving more than 100,000 Africans of their rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and in some degree to their lives, if these rights are so absolutely unalienable." Please excuse my terrible accent. So clearly Hutchinson read this text and thought, like many people since, that of course it does pertain to the rights of individual people. To him, that was clear. And Hutchinson wasn't alone. Language similar to what's in the Declaration was used to legally abolish slavery in both Massachusetts and Vermont. In Massachusetts, the state constitution has a line which reads, quote, "All men are born free and equal." And in a 1781 Massachusetts Supreme Court case, the Massachusetts High Court ruled that basically, if all men are born free and equal, then slavery has to be illegal. Vermont, too, takes care of this in their state constitution, writing that, quote, "All persons are born equally free and independent, and therefore," and I'm paraphrasing this part, "slavery is illegal." So clearly, there were plenty of people who believed at the time that the language of "all men are created equal" means individual rights for all. But not everyone believed that because, of course, slavery remained intact. And most people, when they read the Declaration of Independence in the 1770s, didn't even think about slavery. To them, the Declaration was about something else entirely. It had nothing to do with the rights of individuals. This was the beginning of the debate over the true meaning of the Declaration, a debate that we can see playing out throughout American history. In the infamous 1857 Dred Scott v. Sanford Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney claims there's no way that the founders meant to include African Americans when they said that all men are created equal. It just wouldn't have made sense in a slaveholding society. Taney goes on to issue one of the most damaging Supreme Court decisions for the Black freedom struggle, that people of African descent cannot be citizens. Abraham Lincoln, of course, disagrees with Taney and believes that the Declaration of Independence is a promise for rights for everyone. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to point out that different people have different reasons for taking up this debate about the meaning of the Declaration. Some have political ends. They want to use the document to support their cause. And of course, these political goals will influence the way that one reads the text. We talked about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. invoking the words of the Declaration in his I Have a Dream speech. That speech was inspiring and important for our country. But that doesn't mean that King's analysis of the Declaration of Independence was entirely historically correct. He had a political agenda. Yes, a virtuous one, but an agenda still, which means we can think of his analysis as somewhat politically motivated. You could say the same about Roger Taney or Abraham Lincoln or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. My goal is to look at this question from a historical, not a political lens. I want to genuinely understand what Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and others were trying to communicate with all men are created equal. Not because I think those men were always right or that we should agree with them, but just because I think it's worth knowing the truth. And in a way, the fact that this document has become so politicized over the centuries has obscured the answer to that question. Historian Danielle Allen believes that the phrase all men are created equal was in fact meant to confer individual rights to all, black and white. Her 2014 book, Our Declaration, makes the case that the Declaration of Independence is about individual equality. Historian Jack Rakove believes that the Declaration is about a different kind of equality, the equality of the American colonists as a people, and the right to declare independence and become an equal people among the nations, not necessarily equal to one another. Rakove explains that this was the most common understanding of the Declaration at the time. The idea of the Declaration as supportive of individual rights didn't become popular until after the Revolution. I believe that Rakove is correct. It was not the intent of the founders to argue that each individual person is equal and entitled to rights. Some of them might have believed that, or some version of it, but it's not what they were saying in the Declaration of Independence. We can look at the writings of Jefferson and his contemporaries before and after the Declaration to really understand what they meant. In Thomas Jefferson's 1774 Summary View of the Rights of British America, he's basically angry blogging about the actions and decisions of the British government. And I'll remind you that this is a couple years before the Declaration of Independence. And he says a few things here that really give important context for all men are created equal. He writes about the, quote, encroachments and usurpations attempted to be made by the legislature of one part of the empire upon those rights which God and the laws have given equally and independently to all. So when Jefferson talks here about the rights which God has given equally to all, he's talking about rights in a collective sense. He's talking about the encroachments of British Parliament on the rights of the American colonists as a group. So when Jefferson uses the word equality here, he means that we as a people are equal to you as a people, and therefore you can't deprive us of our rights. There's more evidence for this throughout the document. He writes about the right to, quote, free trade with all parts of the world as something that American colonists have as of natural right. Free trade is something that an entire economy does, not an individual person. So here again, Jefferson is referring to the rights of the colonists as a group. And later in the same document, he challenges the British government, asking, can any one reason be assigned why 160,000 electors in the island of Great Britain should give law to 4 million in the states of America, every individual of whom is equal to every individual of them, in virtue, in understanding, and in bodily strength? Once again, equality is discussed in collective terms. Jefferson is saying, we're just as virtuous, smart, and strong as you, so why should you be able to make laws for us? The word equality was also used at this time to criticize monarchy as a form of government. A system of government that elevated certain people to positions of power just because the king said so was seen as unfair. We can look at Thomas Paine's Common Sense, an anti-monarchy, pro-revolution pamphlet that circulated in the colonies in the mid-1770s. In that pamphlet, Paine used the word equality when talking about countries that have elected republican governments instead of a king. The word equality was often used in this context at that time. When a government was unequal, it meant that political stations were artificial and undeserved, especially when the people lacked political representation, like American colonists. It didn't mean that they had any problem with inequality across individuals within a society. Basically, all men are created equal meant that Britain shouldn't rule America, and to some, it meant that nobody should be a king. It did not necessarily mean that nobody should be a slave. We can look to still other documents for evidence that these men were not intending to change the social status quo with the Declaration of Independence, only the political one. One big hint comes in the Continental Congress's Bill of Rights and List of Grievances, not to be confused with the Constitution's Bill of Rights. In that document, they explain that the colonists are entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and property, and they go on to explain why the colonists have those rights. And they say something quite revealing in this document. They basically say, look, our ancestors had the full rights of Englishmen when they settled these colonies, and they never forfeited those rights, and therefore we, as British subjects today, should have those rights too. And this is so important because it means that the colonial leaders didn't see their rights as derived from God or from the universe, but from their political status as Englishmen. And if that's true, that means they would not have included African Americans or women in their framework of rights. This becomes abundantly clear when we investigate John Adams, one of the key authors of the Declaration of Independence. Adams writes to his wife Abigail in April 1776 that he's concerned the revolution has, quote, loosened the bands of government everywhere. He says that just because the colonists are defying the authority of the British doesn't mean enslaved people can defy the authority of their masters, or children of their school teachers, or women of their husbands. He's especially critical of enslaved African Americans who seek freedom during this period of upheaval. And on the issue of women's rights, he tells Abigail, quote, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. So I don't think we can consider John Adams very progressive, even by 1776 standards. There's tons of evidence that the writers of the Declaration of Independence did not mean for that document to be a statement about universal human equality. They simply wanted to explain and convince people that they had the right, or in fact the necessity, to start their own country. They understood the world through a series of hierarchies, some unjust, like the British rule over the colonies, but others as perfectly natural in their eyes, like the supremacy of white landholding men. We might want to believe that they were challenging the racist and sexist assumptions that were governing colonial society, but the evidence is to the contrary. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When I teach about the Declaration of Independence to my U.S. history, civics, and government students, I get really excited about that sentence. We spend a lot of time on it. I tell them that this is the most important sentence in American history, that the heart of the American project is captured in that text. Is that dishonest of me? No, I don't think so. It would be a lie to say that the founders intended for that sentence to mean equality for every man, woman, and child. But it's not a lie to say that countless people have interpreted it that way since. To the women at the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Independence was a framework through which to build a better future. For enslaved men and women who read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence was perhaps a glimmer of hope that their descendants would not have to suffer the same fate. For the people in the audience at Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, the Declaration of Independence was a promise that everyone has a stake in this country. And for students today, the Declaration of Independence is an inspiration. You get to live in a country dedicated to the principle of equality. This sentence has been at the center of the American conversation for a long time. To be clear, the work of historic truth-seeking is important. The reality is that the Founding Fathers were not endorsing individual equality and that they meant something different altogether. This fact has been distorted by time and by politics, and understanding the reality helps us better grasp the founding era. In that sense, this investigation really matters. But in terms of whether it should change the way we feel about the Declaration of Independence or about American history, that's a different question. Perhaps it's ironic that this sentence, which was written as part of a much less important preamble and which has been misinterpreted by so many people, has achieved almost mythic status in the United States. But then again, that's what people do. They look to history for individuals, for stories, or in this case, for sentences which resonate with them. They create myths, they tell stories about their nation's history to help them make sense of the current moment. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Even if that doesn't tell us much about what mattered to Thomas Jefferson, it tells us a whole lot about what has mattered to Americans since. So if you're someone who finds yourself inspired by the words of the Declaration, you shouldn't let anything in this podcast change that. It just turns out that you're inspired less by what the Founding Fathers meant to convey and more by the meaning that Americans have given to the document since. If anything, that's just evidence that this country is a constantly evolving project. Even while we look to history for guidance, we can always redefine what it is that we're all about. And that's a good thing. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Declaration Station, and I hope this gave you something to think about today.